Are you a fan of spine-chilling tales of the unexplained? If so, get ready for an exciting new podcast experience, Chillers and Thrillers. Immerse yourself in the world of the paranormal as I, your host, narrate true stories about people's hair-raising encounters with ghosts, demons, and other eerie phenomena. In Chillers and Thrillers, I'm dedicated to bringing you authentic, bone-chilling accounts without any comedic elements or skepticism. So dim the lights, leave your skepticism behind, and settle in comfortably for our bi-monthly episodes, available on your favorite podcast platforms.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now, you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. I've said it in previous episodes, but to date, I haven't ever played with a Ouija board. It's not for lack of curiosity, as much as I'm horrified by the thought of something evil or demonic coming through. I listen to a lot of scary story podcasts, and generally, my most favorite episodes, those that creep me out the most, are the ones that tell stories of religious hysteria and demonic possession. Today's episode is unique because it's the first ever story swap, where I'll narrate stories that were originally recorded on another show. In this case, Chillers and Thrillers, one of my favorite spooky podcasts. If you haven't yet, be sure to give Chillers and Thrillers a follow or subscribe wherever you stream podcasts. Host M is a terrific storyteller who will make you feel like you're sitting around a campfire with good friends. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore a collection of true Ouija board stories. Do you have the nerves to play with a Ouija board? And what would you do if you summoned something dark and malevolent? I'll share the stories. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. Our first Ouija board story is entitled Q and was written by Riotous Tripod. Quote, in the interest of full disclosure, I suppose I should start by saying that I am an absolute 100% believer in ghosts. I've seen and heard too many things to be left with any doubt. One of my earliest memories is seeing what I now believe to be the ghost of a Confederate soldier in my grandparents' home. But that however terrifying it may have been for 3-year-old me, doesn't come close to making the list of the scariest moments of my life. I was intensely interested in the paranormal from early childhood. Even in elementary school, I devoured every book on ghosts, hauntings, and psychic phenomena I could get my hands on. As I grew up, I had several experiences I simply couldn't, and still can't, explain. In my late teens and early 20s, I discovered that many of my friends shared my interest, and quite a few had had experiences of their own. It wasn't long before we had acquired tape recorders, cameras, and a drive to investigate anywhere we thought had even a remote chance of harboring any sort of haunting activity. We had some astonishing successes, captured some of the best EVP I've ever heard, although a disappointing lack of good photos, and got more and more adventurous as time went on. Eventually, as was bound to happen, one of us, we'll call him Brandon, decided we were missing one critical piece of equipment: a Ouija board. I wish I could say I tried to warn Brandon off of this thing from the start, but I'd be a liar if I did. I was a little uneasy about it, and found that whenever my hands were on the planchette, we didn't seem to get anything. But as soon as my hands were off, it seemed to come alive. I still don't know why this should have been, but I chalked it up to some kind of mental block and designated myself secretary, writing down and interpreting whatever came through. In a way, the board was great. We could all indulge our ghost hunting curiosity without having to leave the house. We had all sorts of interesting things come through, and at first, they seemed harmless. But before long, things took a frightening turn. I started to become uncomfortable with the whole Ouija thing. I'm not sure why. I wasn't one to discourage everyone else, though, so I kept my concerns to myself. Even when my friends were saying they'd been repeatedly contacted by evil spirits, I kept my mouth shut. I'm a believer in ghosts, and always have been, but I didn't think they could cause any real harm. Brandon and some of the others started saying they'd made contact several times through the Ouija board with Q, who they were convinced was not only evil, but possibly demonic. Q supposedly said some very threatening things, and made everyone present uncomfortable for reasons no one could quite articulate. There just seemed to be a general feeling of dread whenever Q would start talking. I was never present for any of this, and absolutely did not take it seriously. I'm a little ashamed to admit I thought it was one of our other friends messing with everybody by manipulating the board. As time went on, fewer and fewer of our group were willing to participate in the Ouija sessions, and Brandon's board soon fell into disuse. Shortly thereafter, he joined the military and went off to basic, leaving the Ouija board with the rest of his stuff in his bedroom at his parents' home. Months later, Brandon ended up getting stationed right back in our hometown and moved back in with his parents. One night, I invited him and several more friends down to my dad's place. I was between apartments, for a few drinks around a bonfire, and Brandon called me asking if I would mind if he brought the Ouija board along to burn. I asked why. He said he'd been hearing things in his bedroom, having weird dreams, even thinking he'd seen some things he couldn't just write off. His parents had even mentioned some strange things that had him concerned, and he had become more and more convinced that the Ouija board was the problem. None of this had happened before he brought it home and used it to speak to the malevolent Q. I hadn't thought about Q in months, and even then wasn't afraid of him. I still thought he was the product of overactive imaginations, and maybe some mind-altering substances. And even if he was real, I was absolutely convinced he couldn't cause anyone harm. but I figured if it would make my buddy feel better, there was no harm in it. So I told Brandon to go ahead and bring the board with him. When he showed up, a few of our more skeptical friends had already arrived, and he told me he wanted to wait until they left to burn the board. I guess he was a little embarrassed by the whole thing. I told him that was fine, and stashed it in my bedroom, figuring I would go get it once the skeptics were gone. As it happened, the fates had other plans. My girlfriend at the time, Jess, had entirely too much to drink and required my undivided attention, and Brandon had quite a bit as well. So by the time we all went to bed, the board was still in its box, lying forgotten on my bedroom floor, in the corner underneath a table. The next morning brought hangovers all around, and, on my part at least, our previous night's mission was forgotten. I didn't stay at my father's place every night, mostly because it's quite a bit farther away from civilization than my mother's, and I was free to crash wherever I wanted. On nights my girlfriend stayed with me, though, my dad's had some definite advantages in the form of a larger bed and fewer interruptions. And so it happened that a week or so after the bonfire, Jess and I found ourselves back at my dad's house for the evening. I was in the habit of falling asleep with the TV on, which Jess could not abide, so we compromised by letting her sleep facing the wall, while I slept on the outside of the bed, much closer to the TV so that I could still have a little volume. On this particular evening, though, she was having trouble getting to sleep and asked me to turn it off. A little annoyed, I complied and started to doze off myself. A few minutes later, Jess made the comment that it was too dark in the bedroom. I told her she was imagining things and to try to get some sleep. In reality, I knew exactly what she was talking about and was praying she would let it go, because I didn't have an explanation and was starting to get a little creeped out. I don't know how to describe it, except to say that the whole room seemed like it had had the brightness turned down. The shadows were deeper than normal, and the light from the window didn't seem to penetrate as well as it should have. And somehow, the darkness seemed to be emanating from the corner of the room, the corner with the TV, right next to my side of the bed. I couldn't explain it. I didn't understand it, and I certainly didn't like it. But I was adopting the mindset that if I ignored it, everything would be all right. It wasn't the first time something creepy had happened in my dad's house, and it had always amounted to nothing. Jess seemed to take my word for it, and soon fell asleep. I turned my back to the darkness. I've always been a side sleeper, and drifted off right behind her. I don't know how long I was asleep exactly, but I awoke with a start and several things were wrong. The first was that I was on my back, and as I just mentioned, I sleep exclusively on my side. The second was that the darkness had deepened to the point that the room was darker than I would have thought possible, as if the window had not just had the blinds closed, but had been sealed up entirely. The third was the horrific visage staring down at mine from perhaps 2 feet above me. The encounter couldn't have lasted more than half a second, but as many who have been in life or death situations can tell you, time has a funny way of slowing down in moments of abject terror. One result of this is that the face has been burned indelibly into my mind, though to this day I lack the words to adequately describe it. It was smooth, impossibly smooth, unblemished by any wrinkles whatsoever. It had no eyes, but I had no doubt that it was staring into mine, just the same. Instead, where its eyes should have been were great, gaping holes, voids that I could feel beckoning to me. Its mouth was impossibly wide, wider than any earthly physiology would allow, stretching all the way from one side of the head to the other. And it was grinning. It had a rictus grin that reminds me now of the Cheshire Cat from hell. Wide, malicious, and full of impossibly sharp, perfectly interlocking teeth. This is what was leaning over me as my eyes snapped open that summer night. And even now, years later, just typing this out has my heart pounding. I was vaguely aware of a body. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, because it was standing on the floor and leaning over my bed, its head still much farther above mine than seemed possible for any average human man. But the face is the only thing that sticks out in my mind. The face and the teeth. Especially the teeth. I was awake instantly. No lingering fatigue plagued my mind. And from the moment I registered what I was seeing, I reacted instinctively. I was trained in martial arts by my father from a very young age, and as a result, my fight or flight response seems to default to the fight position 9 times out of 10. This was no different, and with this presence looming over me, there was nowhere to fly to anyway. I screamed, a cry of abject terror that expelled every ounce of air from my lungs. My left arm shot up, seeking to grasp this thing by the throat, and in one fluid motion I sat up, flipped over, and tried to chokeslam it into the bed. By the time my hand connected with the mattress, I realized I had missed, and when I looked back the thing was gone, the darkness fast receding, but not fast enough to make me doubt what I had seen. Jess woke up with a start, asking what the hell was going on, but it was several minutes before I could answer. I had gone from dead asleep to hyperventilating in an instant, and I was trying desperately to tell myself I hadn't seen what I thought I'd seen. Trying to no avail. When I finally composed myself enough to explain, I had had time to look around the room and realized that in the corner from which the earlier darkness emanated was Brandon's Ouija board, the conduit to Q. That was it for my sleep that night. I told Jess what had happened, mostly, but told her that it was just a nightmare. I wasn't ready to talk about it yet, and wouldn't be for some time. I took the board out to my car and locked it in the trunk. I wasn't really ready to deal with it, but I knew I needed it out of the house. The next morning, I took Jess home, then tossed the board, box, and planchette in the fire pit, doused it liberally with gasoline, said a prayer, and lit it up. The box and various branches in the pit caught immediately, but I swear the board itself took several minutes before the flames finally took it. It taunted me in those last moments. I can't explain it any other way. I'm happy to say that I never saw Q again after that. Never felt the darkness deepen that way in my room or any other. The experience didn't scare me off of ghost hunting. I went on to get some pretty incredible EVP and amass a few more fantastic stories. I'm happy to talk about most of these experiences to anyone who's interested. My encounter with Q, however, I usually keep to myself unless I have to warn someone off of meddling in things they don't understand. I will never in life touch another Ouija board. I've had enough nightmares for one lifetime. End quote. Our second Ouija board story is entitled The Intact Ouija Board and was written by JDR123. Quote, So this is the reason why I hate Ouija boards and refuse to go near one. My college roommate's father also happened to be the pastor of the Presbyterian church that my family attended while I was in junior high and high school. His father was also a pastor, and he'd grown up as a missionary kid in Venezuela. One time, while our parents were visiting us at college, he told us that when he was a child, about 10 years old, there was a traditional medicine man / witch doctor in the Venezuelan village where his family lived. The medicine man decided to give up his practice and brought all of his tools and supplies that he had supposedly used to heal people, tell fortunes, and communicate with spirits in order to curse people, to my pastor's father, the village pastor, and asked if he could dispose of them. His father gathered some of the other church-going men in the village, trekked a mile or so into the woods near the village, and burned all of the supplies, including a Ouija board. They literally watched everything burn to ashes, then doused the ashes with water, and returned to the village for the evening. However, the next day, my pastor and his family awoke and found the Ouija board completely whole and sitting on their kitchen table in their house. My pastor said that his father's face went completely white, and he immediately grabbed the Ouija board and took it outside, chopped it into pieces with an axe, burned the pieces, and buried the ashes. It didn't come back, but it was terrifying enough to stay in his memory and definitely freak me out for the rest of my life when he told us the story. It isn't something that he talks about often, as he said it was very disturbing and not something he likes to give attention to. He mentioned that they had some other supernatural demonic encounters while living as missionaries in Venezuela, including his parents' bed shaking violently in the middle of the night while they heard screams, etc. I'm usually skeptical of these stories, but I know him to be an honest, sincere man, and I absolutely don't believe that he would ever make those stories up." End quote. Our third Ouija board story is entitled John and was written by Samantha. Quote, "Backstory. My mom is English and didn't move to America until she and my dad married when they were 21. When she was 16 and still living in England, there was one particular night that scared the mess out of her. My grandmother, Mom's mom, had been at a friend's house that night and played with a Ouija board. My grandmother says they came in contact with a ghost who said his name was John, that he was 8 years old, and that he died in a fire. My grandmother was so thoroughly freaked out that she ran all the way home and had a fit in the living room with my granddad. Fast forward about 15 years. I'm a little girl, around 2 or so, when I start talking about an invisible friend named Shadow. Shadow goes everywhere with us. One time, he travels to England on a family trip. Mom says she was never really scared of me talking to something named Shadow, but that it was spooky when I would do things like randomly stop playing in the garden, look up at a window, and wave, as if Shadow had called out to me and said hello. Mom said I spent ages sitting in my crib, talking to the corners of my room as if someone were there, carrying on whole conversations. Shadow was my BFF for years, and when I was about 4 or 5, Mom randomly asked me why I called him Shadow, and how I came up with that name. Because that's the way he looks. What do you mean? I mean, he's all shadowy. Oh, so you call him Shadow? Yeah, but his real name is John. He died in a fire when he was 8. That's why he's all shadowy." End quote. Our final Ouija board story is entitled The Fraternity, written by OZ Jesting. Quote, "In 1986, I attended one semester of college in small-town Marshall, Missouri. Go Vikings. Small school, small population, but a lot of big fun. The school had 3 dorm facilities for general students, and there was also 3 fraternity houses. As the school was Christian aligned, the dorms had very strict rules such as no alcohol, no opposite sex in room after 9, curfew, etc. The frat houses did not have such rules. So while I don't subscribe to the frat ideal, I convinced a bunch of my fellow theater types to join one of the houses to have better living arrangements. I am not sure the football team, traditional keepers of the house, were thrilled to see us arrive. But we did win the skit comp handily during Greek week. One of the general dorm buildings was 3 stories tall, but the 3rd floor had been closed for ages. There was a story about a student, Stephen, who had died in his room on the 3rd floor. But this was just a sad fact. It hadn't been a gruesome murder or some crazy suicide. In fact, it happened so long ago that the few teachers who remembered it seemed to think it was just natural causes of some sort. It wasn't in any way a campus ghost story at all. The fact that the floor was closed was also coincidence, just bad repair. It had remained open for years after his death. Halloween week rolls around. One of the theater boys, Bobby, thinks it would be fun to do a seance with a Ouija board Halloween night. So about half the fraternity jams into Bobby's room around 10 p.m. Small room, typical double bunk beds, but now stuffed with about 15 of us, most football players. It was drunken, rowdy, and had all the classic jibes and catcalls you would expect from young men in this scene. We turned off the lights and had a few candles around for atmosphere. Dave, the punter, was on the Ouija board with Bobby. The mucking around settles as Dave starts a beautiful monotone delivery that was very hypnotic. A bunch of cartoon-style Halloween invocations are made. The dial on the board is pushed around, but nobody is really sure what is supposed to be happening. We are about to call it a night when one of the guys suddenly says, "Hey, why don't you 2 try and make contact with Stephen?" Dave agrees and begins once again with the intonation, but the focus now makes everything suddenly seem more eerie. "Stephen, join us in the room, Stephen. We want to contact Stephen. Step through the veil, Stephen." Suddenly, the dial flips off the board and clatters to the floor, startling the room. Dave bends to retrieve it. When he sits back up with the dial, a shrill gasp escapes his mouth as he sees Bobby. Bobby is now slumped forward, head on chest. He is gurgling, guttural sounds pushing through spittle and much lolling out of his mouth. Half the room is suddenly terrified, other half skittishly joking about Bobby faking it. Dave starts asking questions. "Are you Stephen? Tell us what happened, Stephen," and so on. Bobby never says anything intelligible, just groans, quiet murmurs, and a whole lot of noise and mouth snot oozing and flapping around. This lasts maybe 3 to 5 minutes. Finally, our running back freaks right out, leaps off the bed, snaps on the lights, and rushes out of the room. Bobby suddenly sits up straight, and in a very confused voice asks what is happening. He says he didn't remember a thing. In his version of the story, the dial had just hit the floor, and suddenly Jason was running out of the room. Dave quizzed him. We all tried to get him to admit he was just faking us out, but he seemed terribly confused. Adamant it had not happened. He wanted to know what prank we were playing on him. That was that. We dispersed. Many of the team wouldn't hang with Bobby for weeks. Bobby never understood why he was being treated with spooky concern. What do I think? It was weird. Bobby was a terrible actor, so I really don't think he had the chops to do what I saw. He was also terribly vain. Had he pranked, I would have expected grandiose dialogue from the quote-unquote possession, and certainly not a bucket of mucus all over his shirt. I also would have expected him to eventually come clean, just to show us how good he was to fool us all. It never happened. Weird. End quote. I'll admit, these stories don't make me want to play with a Ouija board anytime soon. Especially the story about John. What about you? Do you have a scary Ouija board experience? If so, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com and I'll feature your story in an upcoming episode. Huge shout out to M, host of Chillers and Thrillers, for sending these stories. Don't forget to follow Chillers and Thrillers wherever you stream podcasts. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with these lingering questions. Do you have the nerves to play with a Ouija board? And what would you do if you summoned something dark and malevolent? I've shared the stories. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.